Welcome to the Alumni Fellows Reading Series at the Hutchins Center, in which former fellows discuss their recent works. Our discussant today is esteemed alum fellow Paul Kaplan. He is professor of art history at SUNY Purchase, and he'll be introducing our guest, Adrienne Childs. Thank you, Paul. The podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Krishna. I am very happy to be here, returning the favor to Adrian, who played this role when I gave a talk in the same series a few months ago. Adrienne Childs is an art historian and curator. She's a senior consulting curator at the Phillips Collection and associate of the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research here at Harvard. She guest curated the exhibition Riffs and Relations, African American Artists and the European Modernist Tradition in 2020 at the Phillips Collection. To my great sorrow, I never got to see this show, but she'll be talking about it, and there's a wonderful catalog that helps one visualize it. Her current book project is Ornamental Blackness, the Black Figure in European Decorative Arts, forthcoming from Yale. And I want to add that for Riffs and Relations, Childs was the recipient of the James A. Porter and David C. Driscoll Book Award in African American art history, a real distinction. Before I let Adrienne start, I just want to say a few personal words. I met Adrienne for the first time through my former colleague, Krista Clark, who's also been part of this series. Krista used to work at the Neuberger Museum on my campus. But I feel like I really got to know Adrienne when we were together breaking into the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris. Unfortunately, we were not able to repatriate any objects after that breaking and entry. We were just there for a conference, but I'm willing to undertake something like that with her in the future. So let me turn it over now to Adrienne.
Well, thank you, Paul. You're reminding me of good times, good times. Well, I'm happy to be here to share my work and to be, under the umbrella of the Hutchins Center that has supported me in my scholarship for many, many years. Let's see. So, today I'm going to read from my exhibition catalog for the show I curated at the Phillips Collection called Riffs and Relations, African American Artists in the European Modernist Tradition. Now the show, as you see the beautiful installation shot here, focused on how Black American artists kind of engaged with European modernisms, whether modernist artists, whether it's a love-hate relationship, whether it's a nourishing relationship, whether they're riffing, whether they're revering. I mean, there's a very complicated sort of energies that go around it, but Black artists in the United States were informed by modernism. African American art is a modernist project for the most part in the 20th century, grows up alongside modernism. And it's an interesting and fraught dynamic. So I was very delighted that the Phillips Collection was interested in mounting this exhibition that I, along with some other colleagues, helped to dream up. Like I said, I'll be reading from the catalog today, and then hopefully we can talk about it on the other side if there's more questions about the exhibition. Oh, and I was, again, very thrilled, here's the catalog, to receive the David Driscoll James A. Porter Award. Driscoll contacted me in probably March about the award, which I was thrilled, or February, and then of course he passed away in April. So much of this is dedicated to him. So I'm going to read from the section called Gazing Back at Manet. Mickaleen Thomas's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, Les Trois Femmes Noires, is a bold riff on Manet's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or Luncheon on the Grass, and encapsulates the power of the international and intergenerational dialogues that we are exploring in Riffs and Relations. These conversations and/or disputes produce fresh understandings of contemporary Black identities through a negotiation of modernism and race. Thomas staged the photograph in the Museum of Modern Art's Sculpture Garden. It includes 3 glamorous Black female models wearing brightly patterned dresses and stylish jewelry. Vintage fabrics of various designs, artificial fruits and flowers create a sense of 1970s decorative flourish. In the background, Matisse's Back series is visible on the wall, serving as an aesthetic bridge between Manet and Thomas. The 3 Black women are reserved, sensuous, and entirely comfortable occupying this charged space. The photograph was transformed into several different versions, including a dazzling large-scale painting complete with enamel and the artist's signature rhinestones, as well as a small photo collage that was actually in our show. Although the other iterations differ in scale and medium, the sensibilities remain the same. The women gaze back at us, welcoming us into their version of the infamous gathering, while offering up an assertive and expansive view of Black female sexualities and the power of beauty. Thomas's transgressive image has become an icon of 21st century art, echoing in both form and impact Manet's infamous provocation. Luncheon on the Grass, the 1863 painting of a nude woman and 2 clothed men enjoying a picnic in a public park, was a controversial offering from Manet, the determined challenger to art world status quo in Second Empire Paris. The contemporary context of Luncheon lacked the veil of allegory or history to justify the nudity and caused a scandal. The flat, abrupt technique coupled with an indeterminate narrative was offensive to many viewers. Manet's submission of the incendiary painting was not accepted by the conservative jury that regulated the official exhibition of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, known as the Salon. Because of large numbers of rejected entries that year, the first Salon des Refusés, or Salon of the Refused, was established, and Manet's Luncheon was introduced in that forum. Luncheon on the Grass, therefore, began its public life as an agitator, operating from the margins, contesting established traditions. This rogue player was a catalyst for modernist art, inspiring critical responses and interrogations that have continued into the 21st century. Many important artists have weighed in on Manet's Luncheon. Between 1959 and 62, Picasso created a body of work inspired by Luncheon on the Grass, including 27 paintings, 150 drawings, 3 linoleum cuts, and more. This is the largest series of Picasso's variations on European quote-unquote masterworks. While some may consider the appropriation of art historical sources a postmodern phenomenon, Picasso and other modernists regularly riffed on the art of the past as they reckoned with their own artistic patrimony in search of independence. In Riffs and Relations, we include 6 African-American artists who enter into a fruitful dialogue with Manet by centralizing the Black female body in his iconic composition. Their diverse responses to Luncheon on the Grass amount to a sustained dialogue among Black artists across generations whose resistance, rehearsals, and reclamations continue to inspire new generations of artists. The exchange between African-American artists and the, quote, masters of art history is a dialogue that has deep and varied roots. Beginning in the 1940s and throughout his career, Romare Bearden often consulted European art as he fashioned new aesthetic approaches to his complex narratives of African-American life. His 1983 collage painting, Mecklenburg Autumn, Heat, Lightning, Eastward, nods to Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. The sumptuous painting features a seated nude woman and a dressed man in a rural landscape. Their poses evoke the 2 principal figures in Manet's Luncheon, although they are oriented differently. The woman's face, composed of an African mask, gazes toward her companion, not the viewer. Bearden's emphasis on the eroticism of the masked female nude might allude to Picasso's masked prostitutes in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Here, Bearden diffuses layered references to European modernist sources to fashion a sensuous exchange between a Black couple in the electric southern heat. The explicit eroticism of Bearden's nude woman in the company of a clothed man privileges the male consumption of the female body, recalling Manet's original. Bearden felt an expressed kinship for Manet. In a 1973 letter written to Mary Schmidt Campbell, Bearden wrote, Manet is one of my most favorite artists, one of the last painters to be able to truly paint in the grand manner. After him, art was to be more informal. I like his elegance, his personality. I find him a very compatible artist. Had we lived in the same time, I'm sure we would have been friends. Art is a continuation. While Bearden's references to and reclamations of this modernist icon remain subtle, Bob Colescott mounted a body resistance using irony, humor, satire, and stereotype as he challenged the tyranny of art history and exposed America's fraught racial dynamics. Colescott stated that his appropriations amounted to taking over or stealing a work from another artist and putting it to his own use. In 1949, the California artist studied in Paris for a year with Ferdinand Léger. Léger encouraged him to focus on figurative art rather than the abstraction that was advocated at the University of California, Berkeley, where Colescott had studied. In Paris, Colescott frequented the museums and availed himself of the rich visual art culture. He saw firsthand many of the paintings that he would later appropriate in his own work. Quote, going to Paris and being able to go to the Louvre every other day was a great revelation to me, he remembered. Sunday afternoon with Joaquin Murrieta, Colescott's defiant response to Manet's luncheon, queries the history of racism in America, while it trades on the infamy of the original painting. Colescott depicts an enigmatic gathering with Joaquin Murrieta, the fabled gold rush outlaw from Mexico, whose life story has become a myth of early California history. An unidentified Black woman, nude save for red cowboy boots, is the female companion to Murrieta and his male compatriot. Strewn on the grass are signs of a rowdy afternoon, complete with women's undergarments, a bottle of alcohol, and a gun. Although Colescott's narrative is equally opaque as Manet's, he hints at the taboo of racial miscegenation and deploys the tensions and anxieties about deviant sexuality that shroud the image of the Black female nude. Yet this tension is aimed to disrupt stale notions of racial and sexual propriety. In the assertive gaze of the female nude, both Manet and Colescott expose social taboos through this charged and incongruous assembly. Indeed, Colescott is working against and in tandem with Manet. Lizetta LaFall Collins observes that, quote, Colescott paid homage to Manet by honoring him with a redo of his painting and celebrating his boldness in bucking the status quo of the French salon, end quote. Many of the responses to European art we consider in Riffs and Relations negotiate the semi-permeable boundaries between intrigue and insubordination. Renee Cox's Cousins at Pussy Pond is another instance in which satire and irony drive the response to Manet's luncheon. Manet's canvas was among several 19th century images of sexual nudes that Cox revised in her 2001 American Family series, deploying the self-portrait to raid art history. In Cousins at Pussy Pond, Cox confidently inhabits the infamous female nude in a bold move that usurps the power of the original model and assumes her position as scandalous provocateur, staring down the viewer. The, quote, cousins who wear loincloths and hold spears repeat and refute the ethnographic images of the primitive, quote, Black bodies that circulated in 19th century Europe. In Cox's response to Manet, all the figures reveal sensuous flesh. Quote, Cox appears to reject feminism's ideological abhorrence to the sexualizing of femininity, states Derek Conrad Murphy, presenting herself as a powerfully sexual being, a kind of Afrofuturist warrior princess, unquote. Shot on location at Pussy's Pond in the Hamptons, New York, the title satirizes the sexual suggestiveness of Manet's work through a self-conscious play on stereotypes of race and sexuality. Weems simply declared that she is not Manet's type. Mm-mm. In this series of photographs, Weems mounts a searing critique on white male modernist artists whose work objectifies or ignores Black female bodies. The narrative caption in the second photo, this is the second photo in the series, proclaims, "It was clear I was not Manet's type. Picasso, who had a way with women, only used me, and Duchamp never even considered me," unquote. The carefully crafted compositions are self-portraits in which a vulnerable Weems, both model and artist, struggles to find her voice in a male-dominated art world in which Manet and Picasso are charged figures. 5 years later, Weems engages Manet's Luncheon on the Grass in After Manet, a work that is part of the May Days Long Forgotten series. The tondo or circular image is a sepia-toned photograph. It features 4 young African-American girls lounging in a pastoral setting. Black girls in innocent repose efface the scandalous nude. Yet 3 adopt her confident gaze while 1 sleeps. While After Manet brushes up against Manet's Luncheon, it moves beyond the exclusive practices of modernist art and provides space for new narratives of beauty, youth, and leisure as the providence of African Americans. Ayanna V. Jackson, too, seeks to present Black women's bodies in a state of leisure in Judgment of Paris, another quotation from Manet's Luncheon. In selecting the title, Jackson moves through Manet to Marc Antonio Raimondi's print, The Judgment of Paris, after Raphael, a work that was actually one of Manet's sources. For Jackson, the mythological story of Paris resonates with her contemporary concerns. She finds that Paris's choice between Hera, who represents power, Athena, who represents might, and Aphrodite, who represents beauty, are elements she associates with Black womanhood. Her artistry is largely centered on redressing the way Black women are represented historically. Jackson's practice is firmly diasporic, dividing her time between New York, Paris, and Johannesburg. In Judgment of Paris, Jackson's figures are all self-portraits, a practice that defines her entire body of work. All 3 figures are clothed, as if to refute Manet's focus on the sensationalized nude. They wear 19th century clothing that recalls studio photographs presenting Black people as urbane individuals in elegant attire. Her focus on leisure and beauty offers a counter-narrative to the notion that Black bodies are static, never-changing stereotypes of subaltern bodies frozen in time. Jackson proposes that ideas about the Black body as colonized, enslaved, or impoverished prevent us from imagining intimate moments of full human lives. Iconic modernist images, such as Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, have been fruitful fodder for Black artists seeking to dispel the myths of race and sexuality that frame the modernist project through the deployment of the Black body. The Black women who have crashed Manet's Luncheon offer alternative narratives about beauty, sexuality, and the voice of the artist. Their collective stare is a bold assertion of power and presence. Postscript. In her story quilt, Le Café des Artistes, Faith Ringgold imagines herself at a collegial gathering at a French cafe, attended by many of the modernist artists, both European and African American, featured in Riffs and Relations. In a congenial, if imaginary, assembly such as this, William H. Johnson, Vincent van Gogh, and Romare Bearden can share a meal. Lois Mailou Jones, Aaron Douglas, and Elizabeth Catlett can chat with Maurice Utrillo and Paul Gauguin. Ringgold's Le Café des Artistes bridges time and space to consider the cross-cultural dialogues and exchanges that occur between African American artists and European modernists. As she considers the dynamics of the group, Ringgold comes to reconcile some of her feelings of marginalization in the modernist art world. Her text in The Quilt's Border acknowledges, quote, "Modern art is not yours or mine, it's ours," unquote. And thank you. That is the end of what I'm going to read today. And I'll ask Paul to join me again.
Adrienne, that was fabulous. I read through that section again this morning, but hearing you deliver it, of course, gives a particular punch to it. And I have to say, the Ringgold, I now have to look and I work on, among other things, images of food, and I have to see what they're eating, but I thought I saw a chocolate eclair down front. So I think there might be some work to do there. I wanted to start by asking you to talk a little bit about the process of putting the show together. It seems to me that anyone trying to mount a show in a rather mainstream museum setting, like the Phillips, is likely to encounter some challenges in trying to frame what is in many ways a critique of modernism, not entirely a critique of modernism, as you've very carefully shown. But I still imagine there could have been some issues there. It was interesting to read in the catalog all about the links between Phillips himself and the Black community in Washington. So clearly there's some roots that might have helped in an institution like this, but I imagine there were other things that were difficult to navigate. So would you say a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting case. Of course, the Phillips, to me, was the perfect place for it to go because it was focusing on modernism. Phillips is the first modern art museum in the United States to open. They have had a real sort of sustained, if up and down, relationship with the Black community. I mean, they're the museum who bought the Jacob Lawrence series, in the 40s. So it was the right place to be, and they were really gracious. It was a great working relationship. But when you go to a place like that has been, kind of spinning the master narratives or the narratives of mastery, with Picasso and Van Gogh and Matisse, I mean, even things like trying to get the people who are the docents or the people who are going to be the education department shepherding it through to understand. One of the things I said that is, I do not want anything that says master artists as compared to like the white artists or the masters and the Black artists are not, because that word master as opposed to a Black person doesn't have a good history in the United States. So I didn't want it to be presented as, the Black artists are looking to the masters and learning from the masters only, you know what I mean? And they're looking to and learning from artists, certainly. But there was more of an exchange than meets the eye, let's say. And all of them are working around the same time. I mean, the early ones are all working at the same time. So while Hale Woodruff is looking at Picasso, while he's literally in the process of creating his Cubist aesthetic. So anyway, so I tried to just sort of diffuse that issue of master versus everybody else. And because one of the things is that I wanted to be sure that this exhibition did was have the actual European art in the room where it happens with the Black artists. And one of the challenges was, how do we balance it or make it such that, like, the Matisse doesn't take up all the air in the room, or the Picasso doesn't, just get take all the attention away. And so I had European art in every room, but I did not have a one-to-one match for each piece. There wasn't always going to be a one-to-one match, and sometimes there was, and I did put them in the room together because I wanted to, and it was see those relationships, and I also wanted the Black artists' work to be hanging with the work that they were engaged with as equals, right? But I didn't want the European artist to take over in a space like that, because the Phillips visitorship is very, very used to seeing those, European modernist masters and American modernists, and they're very engaged with that, so I wanted to add some new dynamics and new dimensions to that. So it's like, how do you install it so that everyone has the equal footing, or what's happening, what the critique is present, but it's not mean-spirited, if you will. So there's all of that bottled into it, and then having to even tell the visitors and the board, we're not trashing this. We're looking at how complicated things are. We had a very large Titus Kaffar that riffed on a Monet that the National Gallery graciously lent. So they were facing each other off. And then it's a beautiful Monet painting. And so you have to be able to talk about it and show what Titus is doing with tar and how he's rethinking Impressionism. But that's not to say that we're throwing Impressionism out with the bathwater. So
no more, for example, than Manet was throwing Raphael out with or Marcantonio Raimondi out with the bathwater in his riff.
Well, he didn't even get in the thing. They had to find another place for him to exist. I mean, he was totally rejected, right. And then becomes the poster child for modernism that as we know it, as we think of it, as this started out, this modern life.
But I think, a good analogy is, again, Manet gets a huge pushback himself, right? But his critique is of contemporary practice. It's not really a critique of the Renaissance paintings that he drew from in order to create that critique. So he's sort of, I think, a good model for what you were trying to do here.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in terms of getting loans and stuff, did you get any pushback from institutions that didn't want to be part of this in any way?
They said, I don't want you to talk bad about my no. I didn't have any. No, the only pushback is that we are, in the last few years, have been living in the age of the Black diaspora artists, the rise, the boom, the flourish, contemporary artists, but that also bleeds out into historical artists. So everybody was having a retrospective. Cole Scott, there was a big retrospective being planned. So the one I wanted for that, I couldn't get that. I couldn't get this. So many different things. That was the problem. But everybody, all the museums really liked the idea, and a lot of them were like, "Ooh, could we talk about it coming here?" And the show didn't travel.
Oh, it's too bad.
So, yeah, but everybody really wanted to participate because they found that an interesting concept.
Yeah, I was tempted to break Pandemic and go down and see it because it had a little coda there, didn't it, at the end of the year?
Yeah,
it was open again.
We were able. It closed. So the audience knows it opened at the end of February and closed March 13th. And then didn't open back up again until probably October, I think. But we were able to keep it through the summer. I mean, we were able to keep those loans because they were supposed to close in May. So literally the show stayed up until January of this year. And in the fall had a limited opening that was always full. And we got good reviews from the Washington Post. Yeah. The conservative guy at the Wall Street Journal, I will call him a guy because I can't curse, was very rude about it because, again, there's something about not understanding what these Black artists are doing. And, so anyway, other than that, we had great reviews. Now everybody's going to go look for that review.
Well, I think it's really encouraging that institutionally that your problem was more all these works are being exhibited elsewhere than some kind of resistance to the idea of doing it. I wanted to raise a question that's sort of close to my thinking about kind of broader issues raised here. And I wonder if you want to say anything about the question of the works that you show being riffed on from the modernist tradition, especially from late 19th, early 20th century avant-garde, mostly do not contain figures of color. The Picasso Demoiselle, of course, does in terms of the mask and so on. But for Manet, for example, a work that was already being riffed on even in the 1860s was Manet's Olympia, right? Would there have been another set of works? Was it just a matter of space that you couldn't go in that direction? Would there have been another set of works that African-American artists said in which they addressed that? Or is it your sense that they were more interested in avoiding representations of people of color in the modernist objects that they were then transforming?
Oh, no, I don't think that at all. There's plenty of artists who have engaged with Olympia, either directly or kind of indirectly. We think that the William H. Johnson nude, Black woman who's on the couch, is a response to Olympia.
Olympia, that's right.
Making the nude a center, front and center. Now, as much as we may have tried, we weren't going to bring Olympia to our. But no, so I think that I just think that the way it worked out, there was so many luncheon on the grass things, and then once you have to, I wanted to do a sort of deep dive on one of these riffs, right? So when we got a great piece with Renee Cox agreed to lend, and then I started looking at others, and then that just built around, and then we got the Cole Scott. Lowry Sims was kind enough to allow me to borrow that one while she could get everything. So that's the way it went. Like if I had gotten the Cole Scott Les Demoiselles d'Alabama, which is just, you got to love that. I might have built a deep dive around Les Demoiselles d'Avignon because we also had Faith Ringgold. So it just depends on how it goes. The show could have been just as good and had a completely different set of images in it because there's just so much of it out there. And you have to make up your mind. There's nothing wrong or right. It's what, how you weave it together. And I tell students all the time, curating is a creative process. Show doesn't exist out there that I could, a right way or a wrong way. It is a personal expression, and luck and all of those other things, and money. But it is a creative process. So this is my, art.
So maybe they'll be around too sometime. I mean, I think it's good for us to know that there is so much out there that impinges on this theme, that any single show can only show a portion of that.
Yeah, I mean, and that as you know that a lot of the stuff when I was conceiving of the way Black artists deal with the European canon writ large was the way this whole thing started out. There's a lot that had to go on the cutting room floor when I narrowed it down to modernism. And so we're still having considered, my co-curator Krista Clark and I are still looking at what we didn't talk about was some of the references to earlier material, and that's with the Black Baroque project, and looking at how Black artists not just engaged the Baroque as a period, but the Baroque as a kind of sensibility, as a presence, as a way of exuberant presence in the contemporary moment. So there's another iteration of some of this kind of stuff coming along, but it's in the nascent stage.
Yeah, I'm sure the pandemic has tripped that up or delayed it a little bit.
Oh yeah.
I was very excited to hear about that in your planning session. Gee, what is it, about 18 months ago now? Yeah. And I can't wait to see what you and Krista will bring forward on with Black Baroque. I wanted to ask you a question. If you have any sense whether the kind of imagery produced was affected by whether or not the African American artist had spent significant time, I guess I would say in Paris in particular, but perhaps also elsewhere in Europe. Is those artists who had periods of being expatriates or at least extended study periods abroad. I mean, you mentioned Colescott's year in Paris and studying with Leger. Do you see that as having a notable impact on the kind of imagery that it's eventually produced? Are the artists who had that kind of more in-depth experience of living in the center of early 20th century modernism, are they more likely to be sympathetic to the imagery or more harshly critical toward it?
That's interesting. If I was to think about it, they might be more likely to be sympathetic. I'm thinking of people like Woodruff, Hale Woodruff being there. Of course, Tanner is there. He becomes, for all intents and purposes, a French man. But and so yeah, I see the early 20th century people as being the first sort of guard. Black artists who are going there and who are learning, and that what makes it, I think, their artistry different once they come back or once they continue on the careers is just the kind of freedom and the expansiveness that they could see themselves participating in the art world because of the lack of that freedom in the United States that they were experiencing. So William H. Johnson, Woodruff, I'm trying to think, there were female artists, of course, who came there as well, but I don't know that I have any early 20th century female artists in the show.
Right.
Now I'm going to be, don't write to me. Don't send me any emails, people. But but I think they saw them that they talk about freedom and all of that. I mean, there was still racism going on, but just the ability to go there and just experience something new and to absorb and engage. And many of those artists actually were showing in galleries, whereas they would probably not have been able to show in these mixed galleries in the United States in the 1930s necessarily. But Woodruff was showing in these galleries in Paris in the 30s with other French artists, other School of Paris artists.
Really amazing. Yeah.
They were coming around. Of course, Tanner was showing there. And by the 40s and 50s, there's a huge influx of Black artists, and they are all showing, and these are, and they're not segregated by race. So just to even be in those kind of dialogues has to give you some kind of a charge. And one of the beef I do have, though, is that the School of Paris is a way of kind of umbrella term for looking at all these immigrant or artists from other places, and even artists who were there. Like sometimes you think of Matisse as a School of Paris artist, even though he's from France. But Picasso, all of those, Modigliani, Brancusi,
somewhere else, yeah.
come somewhere else, and and so do people like Woodruff. So do people like Tanner. You never hear them talk about any Black American artists as School of Paris.
Wow.
Wow. So I never really dug into that, but they come even as late as the 40s and 50s, and Beaufort Delaney, and then they come for a minute and they stay forever. Carol Cousins was someone who was a Washingtonian, who's fairly unknown, who's been in a couple of shows that deal with this material, and he went for a week and never came back. So those kinds of things happen all the time. They're happening, so there is a Black critical mass of Black artists, Sam Middleton, who went to Europe and engaged with one another. And I don't know that we've really been able to give them a label yet, but I think it does change what they do and how they see themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think we now need to pioneer that terminology to include them. That's absolutely right. My gosh. I wanted to ask you this is ranging a little far afield, but not too far, I think, because just before your show opens, we have these other shows opening in Paris or focusing on Paris, but with an emphasis on the participation and the representation of Blackness the show at the Wallach Art Gallery at Columbia, Posing Modernity, curated by Denise Morel, and then a larger show at the Musée d'Orsay, the Black Model, the Modèle Noir. Did these shows affect your planning in any way? How do you see what you're presenting here dovetailing with that or rather different perspective, a perspective more specifically from the Parisian environment?
That's interesting. I went and met with Denise Murrell while she was still working on her Posing Modernity show, and I was working on mine, and we were talking about our shows. I was concerned. We were introduced by our good friend and colleague, Wendy Grossman, who's also helped part of the Phillips family, who helped me build the Phillips the show there and get me into that venue. But so we were all thinking about how these shows would relate to one another. And there was I didn't find it any overlap, because she's really looking at the model and the female body. And I'm looking at the sort of different way in, but we did end up with some of the same works in the show.
Mm-hmm.
And we were able to both borrow these works, because they both spoke to those issues that she was concerned with, about what were the experiences of the Black models and what the image of the Black female. And we realized how much more important that was than maybe previously considered. In some of those images, particularly with contemporary American artists looking at that, were things that I was interested in, those responses. So I think they are good complement to each other, the shows. And I think that will be important as they have big coattails, and contemporary artists will looking at the material that she uncovered, and the people for the Modèle Noir, which was a huge show. It was like, wow.
With all kinds of different things in
all
there,
kinds of
different
stuff.
themes. Yeah.
Like a hootenanny.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. I did.
I wish I had been there to see it with you. I think that would have, I think we would have had a lot to talk about.
Yeah, there was a lot there. But they uncovered up, uncovered up. Yes, they did. And they uncovered not only a lot of portraits and things we would consider quote unquote fine art, but they went into historical personages and people and clowns and all kinds of stuff. And so and each one could be like its own little exhibition in and of itself, each room.
Sure.
And all that material is going to go a long way in understanding. So Krishna's here.
I see Krishna has popped up. Have we reached the moment for some audience questions?
If you don't mind.
Sure.
Love it.
David Beinman has a question. He raised his hand, so Matt will put him on. David?
Are we going to see?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Right, good. It says the co-host asked you to start your video. Oh, okay. Right. Oh, right. Okay. Can you see? Sorry, I'm not doing this very well.
Maybe one more click.
There we go.
There you
go. Okay. Anyway, wonderful to see you too. I just wanted, one of the things that seems to be coming out of all of this is this whole relationship with Paris. And clearly there's a sort of difference between those artists who stayed and then those who came back. Is there any sort of generalization you can make about why people stayed and why they came back to the US? Because in fact, in a way, it must have been quite a tough decision to come back if you could, theoretically make a living as an artist in Paris.
Generalizations about why people stayed and why people came back. I think it's really very individual, depends on family situations. And it depends on how successful you are in Paris and whether you find, or in Europe in general, whether you find your own, personal network And there was also, depends on also when, I mean, there were people who went there and did not want to come back to the sort of virulently racist, segregated United States. And then there's others who came at a different time and did not have that experience. And then what's interesting to me is those that came with no intention of staying and then end up staying as a surprise, right?
Yeah.
And that story is told over and over and over again. I don't know that Beaufort Delaney thought he was going to stay there and live there. But by that time, there's a nice critical mass of people there, and he's got what's his name? Baldwin is there, and all of that. There's a group there for him. But what I do see is those that come back tend to turn back to African American themes that in their work, like William H. Johnson, and that it's evolved, of course, as work evolves. But when you come back and then this infusion of whatever their experience was abroad, they bring it back and then they bring it to African American themes. Whereas maybe those who are staying in Europe are not necessarily doing that, right?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, the other thing I wanted to ask is about jazz, because there's a similar movement there. And there were people like Sidney Bechet who were very much part of the French scene. Was there a lot of interconnection or meetings between the jazz players and the artists?
Yes, and jazz music in general was very, I think, important to particularly people like Sam Middleton, who was very adamant about staying overseas. And well, I could go on. I'm thinking also for Beaufort Delaney, and Harold Cousins. But I think that the jazz scene was one, and even like Bob Thompson, who comes in a little bit later in the 60s.
Yeah.
There's always seems to be overlap there. Yeah. And even with the European artists, I mean, all of the overlap with Matisse, for instance, in his jazz series.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from John Weiser, and he says or asks, can you talk about the goals of these Black artists and how they put those goals into their art?
The goals. I'm trying to think of what it's so funny. I seldom use that word, but I know it's something that we think about and talk about. But how do we think about their goals? I feel like the younger artists that went, he's talking about those who went abroad or just in general. Read it again.
I'm not sure, but you can take it as you wish.
Mm-hmm. Because, okay, when I was thinking, we were thinking about the issue of going abroad and the goals there, but I'm thinking now that he might be talking about the goals of artists who are actually looking to European art and responding to it, right? And I think that they have some very specific goals, because there's the world of art history, and most of these young artists certainly know all about that. They've studied, they've got master's degrees and all of that. They've studied art history, and art history is all around us. And responding to art history is a trope that a lot of young artists across the board engage in. It's a practice, responding to the history of art and finding your place. And so their goal is to demystify the history of art, to claim a space and a place in this dialogue that has marginalized them, right? And historically marginalized them. And then specifically with modernism, it's to think about the debt to African art and debt to African bodies that modernism presents, and there is, of course, a serious debt to African art. And there's a debt to Blackness in terms of, even with what David was talking about in terms of jazz and just avant-garde practice in general, is really embedded. Black culture is embedded there and somehow gets separated out especially when you're talking about abstraction and things like that. So they're going back to parse that, and their goals are really to try to think about how they they fit into this longer history. And they achieve it sometimes by directly responding or directly representing a work from the past, or maybe they do it in a more abstract way. Maybe they put their own body in a work of art, like Ellen Gallagher puts herself in the middle of a photograph that was coming out of Matisse's studio, where he was sitting next to a model. So Ellen Gallagher puts her face on the model and Freud's head on Matisse, and she's looking at him like, you've got to be kidding me. So, and just that look, like, no, no, don't try to psychoanalyze me, don't try to own me, don't try to make me exotic. So just intervening to make the audience say, oh, just to tweak the audience so that they understand they've consumed these images like Manet's Luncheon, like Matisse's work for so long, and they didn't understand how it controls in certain ways.
Thank you. I'm kind of piggybacking on that question. There's another one, which is queries the connection between European modernism with African artistry. And the question is more, what is the role of the primitive and the ancestral in African American work responding to European modernism?
Yeah, so the book is divided into two. My part is in two major chapters. One of them is on African art in the modern. The other is on contested bodies, and that's what I read from the part on Manet in the contested body section. So the whole other part is trying to work through that, and that is another, talk about sticky issue in trying to put this thing together. Whew. Because primitivism is a major sort of thorny issue, and it's certainly embedded and rooted in the avant-garde practice of Picasso and the German expressionists and many of the School of Paris artists, using that as a tool to sort of free themselves from traditional art practices, et cetera. And so, but it's very controversial. It's rooted in colonialist views. How do those objects even get to the little curio shop in Paris? How did the Congo, coming out of the Congo, what were they doing in the Congo to begin with? I mean, it's almost like some of these objects are bloodstained, but they find their way there, and they become fetishized. And they also engender some really cool stuff. But then when African American artists get wind of this through the Alain Locke connection, they start thinking, they start to engage with African art through people like Picasso and Matisse at the request of Alain Locke, but they also engage it directly, right? They also are understand that their cultural patrimony is kind of gives them a direct, not only link, but access, or it gives them a direct ownership of those ideas that the Europeans are looking for a way out of their Europeanness through Africanness. And so like the African-American artists and the Harlem Renaissance artists are looking away to their Africanness, sort of via some of these European aesthetics. So it's kind of topsy-turvy. And it's, and some of those early African-American artists do engage in a primitivist aesthetic, like Aaron Douglas, even though his intention is very different. Hale Woodruff engages in that aesthetic. So it's complicated, but I wanted to say they did this and they saw it and they grew and they moved on. But it's a really interesting thing. So I have a German expressionist piece in there, 3 Women at a Table. And I also have a Hale Woodruff card players. They're both sitting at a table, both responding to Picasso and African masks and Cubism, but in different ways. But those German expressionists were very important to a lot of American artists, not just African American, in the early 20th century. So we have to look at it like that.
I just wanted to interject. I thought it was so fascinating in that earlier chapter, the way the role that Germany played in all this was in some ways very unexpected to me. Also, some of the early German treatments of African sculpture
Right.
Played a major role.
Right.
Quite surprising. Yeah.
The book Negerplastik, which is means black sculpture, was very important to Hale Woodruff. He was given it to him by the book, which was a photos of African art, given to Hale Woodruff when he was still in Indiana, inspired him to go to Paris, inspired him to study modernism. And he said that book is what reason why I got interested in African art. So this is sort of circuitous roots.
Thank you. A couple more questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Okay. So this question is from Vanessa Valdez. She says, could you speak a little bit more about your Black Baroque show? That sounds fascinating.
Oh, well, it's an idea that Krista Clark and I came up with, looking at the I guess landscape of black contemporary practice, globally, not just American, and thinking about artists like Yinka Shonibare, let's say Nick Cave, Firely Baez, artists whose over determination of the body, the self, seems Baroque, right? There's a theatricality to some of this. There's an intense sort of like I said, or not just ornamentation, but exuberance and a bodily presence that comes out in very exciting ways. And I guess maybe we could link it maybe back to Kehinde Wiley's sumptuousness. But it's a trend that we see going across the board. And it's an interesting concept to engage that, right? And then it also kind of manifests itself as artists who are looking back to the Baroque era, which is sort of the beginning of the triangle, the African Atlantic, the Black Atlantic. And a lot of it is tied into the way Black artists now conceive of themselves in the wake of this trauma, and how it's perhaps a healing, perhaps an overdetermined bodies that are filling voids and things like that. So we're thinking it through. The show, was just in our heads. And no, I mean, we've had some traction, but we don't have a venue. We don't have a plan yet because we had to slow down because of COVID. But we see it as big and splashy and expensive. So if you have a museum that is willing to foot the bill.
Okay, one final question. The question is about the other pieces in the Phillips permanent collection and how they may inspire your future work. In particular, what about those Rothko paintings?
What about those Rothko paintings? They're fantastic. I inspire my future work. I never thought about that. I have not been working in abstraction necessarily, even though I just love them. I love the spirituality of them. But since I'm doing some consulting work with the Phillips, I'm gonna take a second look at that. There's a lot there, and they're new. I guess our new exhibition, Seeing Differently, is just opened. The Phillips is 100 years old. They're celebrating the centennial. And so the exhibition is about a lot of the new acquisitions that have taken place and some of the old gems that have been there for the last 100 years. And it's really worth seeing the diverse and exciting artists that that they've collected over the years. So they're an institution to watch for the next 100 years.
And we will. We watch. Maybe through your eyes.
Yes.
I think we've reached the end of our discussion period. Paul, do you have any final thoughts or comments?
No, except just to express my admiration for the whole Riffs and Relations project, which maybe I just missed the early part of it, but it seems like you got that ball rolling rather rapidly. Again, it's one of my major regrets in this COVID year that I wasn't able to be there, but the catalog is beautifully produced and it will help it live on.
Well, and I will tell the audience that you can actually go on the Phillips website and go to the Riffs and Relations page. There's a tour. You can take the tour, virtual tour, and see the whole thing as it was in all of the galleries. So it's there to walk through, and then a lot of online programming. And we had some really good conversations with people that are very familiar to the Hutchins Center, like Hank Willis Thomas and things. So there's some good programs to look at. Want to
Thank
see.
you. Well, a really great question has come in about Jackson's The Judgment of Paris, but if you prefer, we can email that question to you.
It depends on how hard it is.
It's a fascinating question, but easily answered.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. One of our fellows, Alessandra Di Maio, says, I'm mesmerized by Jackson's The Judgment of Paris, a masterpiece of amplified resignification, to use a term we're all familiar with.
Yes.
So what happens to the gaze in Jackson's Game of Mirrors?
What happens to the gaze? Jackson wants you to gaze at her to see alternative possibilities for Blackness, right? And then of course she returns it like most of the female artists do in that take on that painting. They return it and then own it. But I don't see it as that's one of the things that taking on that Manet painting does is by Black women. It takes the gaze back because they're both artist and model. You know, Jackson is both the artist and the model, so she's controlling everything. Yeah, that's my it's a tough question and something to think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, whenever you talk about mirrors and reflection,
Yeah,
it's a little disorienting.
yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for a really nice, engaging, and informative session.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Paul.
Glad to have been here.
See you next time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.